Welcome, everybody. Part of our continuing series where we talk to activists, reporters, writers, columnists, and professors. Anybody from the left, anybody from the right, as long as they can form a clear, insightful perspective. We want to bring it unedited and unaltered directly to you so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today, it's our privilege to have Professor Michael Huemer. Okay. He's a professor of philosophy at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. He got his PhD from Rutgers in 1998. He came to CU Boulder in 1998 and works mainly in epistemology, ethics, metaethics, and political philosophy, which we'll be talking about today. Professor Huemer has written on such topics as political skepticism, ethical intuitionism, deontological ethics, and political authority, among others. Some of the selected papers was Existence is Evidence of Immortality, Dialogues of Ethical Vegetarianism, Is There a Right to Immigrate? When is Parsimony a Virtue? Compassionate Phenomenal Conservatism. He also studied at the University of California, Berkeley. Awesome. And he went to Rutgers. Some of his academic positions have at the University of Colorado and at Tulane University. Some of the courses taught have been Introduction to Philosophy, Symbolic Logic, Ethics, Philosophy and Science Fiction, Major Social Theories, Economics, Game Theory and Rational Choice, History of Science, Epistemology, Metaethics, Metaphysics, Philosophy of Science. And here's some of the work that was done specifically on social and political. If you go to the professor's CV, there's different areas. I only focused on the social political. When to Suppress Speech for the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy. That's a very distinguished journal. Reflections of an Apostate. The Right, Anarchy, Capitalist or Socialist. Gun Rights as Deontic Constraints. Tax Breaks for the Rich in Defense of Illegal Immigration. An Introduction to the Problem of Authority. Can constitutions limit government? Is wealth redistribution a rights violation? So a lot of academics studies across the board looking at various different political issues. And these are some of the areas that the professor worked on. The duty to disregard the law. Why are we irrational about politics? We'll definitely be talking about that. Is there a right to own a gun? Gun rights and noncompliance, America's unjust drug war. Totally agree. Is there a right to immigrate? The right to move versus the right to exclude in praise of passivity. Devil's advocates on unjust legal advocacy. Is wealth redistribution a rights violation? Statistics on the cost of government, the theory of economic value, and TV contract. And that's it. Let's check in and see how far we did, or how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Did we get anything wrong with your background? Is there something we need to correct?
No, I think that's all correct.
Okay.
I want to plug my book, though. The Problem of
Please, let's see it closer to the camera.
Everybody should read The Problem of Political Authority, which you can get on Amazon.
Let me see if I can pull that up. What is the problem of political authority?
The short version of it is, why do 535 clowns in Washington get to tell everybody else what to do? And, the slightly more sophisticated version is the government does a whole lot of things that if you or I were to try to do them would be considered seriously wrong and would be considered violations of people's rights. But we consider it okay when the government does these things. Like, for example, if I decided I was going to collect taxes, I would be called an extortionist, a thief.
Right.
So why is it okay for them to do those things? Right, that's the basic philosophical problem.
My favorite one, it's kind of popular these days, is insider trading. So if you and I get insider information about certain stock companies and then we trade upon that, you go to prison. But Congress members can do this all the time. I think one of the most famous proliferators of this is Nancy Pelosi, and it's completely legal. And you try explaining that to people, like going, well, Congress can do insider trading, but if you do it, that's a felony and you go to prison, hardcore prison.
Are you sure it's legal? I believe it happens, but I'm
Yeah,
not sure that's legal.
fair enough. Fair
Um,
enough.
yeah,
Fair
but
enough.
yeah, so there's sort of like, well, there's the corruption, but then there's just the stuff that is socially accepted, right? Because
Right.
like taking taxes, that's totally socially accepted, and they do that totally openly, right? But why isn't that theft?
The Problem of Political Authority, an Examination of the Right to Coerce and the Duty to Obey, is a book by University of Colorado philosophy professor Michael Huemer, released in January 2013. First part of the book argues in detail for Huemer's interpretation of philosophical anarchism and argues against the legitimacy of political authority, while the second addresses political anarchism and the practical viability of anarcho-capitalism. That was the description in Wikipedia. Do you feel that's a fair description of the book?
Yeah, that's right. That's what it says. That's what it's about.
Okay, so now we have a little bit of an idea of your background on politics. Let's start with the basics. Is political polarization in America an issue, or is it not that bad and people are just overblowing it because the media wants something to talk about and it's fine and we can basically ignore it because it's not a real issue? Or, oh my God, it hasn't been this bad in a really long time, and that's a fact. Where do you stand, Professor?
Well, I mean, yeah, I seem to have noticed political polarization. I seem to have noticed more than in the rest of my life, I guess. I think it might be the highest it's been in my lifetime. But I hear it was really bad in the 1960s. There was a lot of social unrest because of the war and civil rights movement. Um, it might be overstated, or we might have an exaggerated impression of the amount of polarization because the people that we're constantly hearing from are the most extreme voices. So, like the majority of people are not extremists. The majority of people are moderates. But in our current culture, the moderates are usually keeping quiet, and the extremists are just, loudly blathering all the time. So I think we do have an exaggerated impression of it, but like that is still a problem actually, because a small number of people who are like super polarized can be a problem for society if those people have a lot of influence, which they do.
So most of the public is moderate, but there is a vocal minority that exaggerates the amount of polarization. Yes, there's some polarization. Yes, it's bad. It's the worst you've seen. Maybe it's not as bad as the 1960s. We're not here to say, but it's pretty bad. But it's still exaggerated, even as bad as it is. Is that fair?
Probably, yeah.
And most of the public is themselves moderate, but they don't, I guess, they're not as loud. The
Yeah,
moderates don't
like,
seem to get as loud.
yeah, so in the academic world, um, the academy is largely taken over by wokeists, right? And the wokeists, like, all they care about is race and gender and stuff like that. Okay, and they're very they're very strident about affirmative action. But actually, most Americans are against affirmative action, including most Democrats. Right? And so it's like you get the impression that the view of the left is all like, in favor of racial preferences for minorities. But actually, it's just that, the Democratic Party has been taken over by its extremists, right? Which also the Republican Party was taken over by its extremists, right? The average voter would probably like more moderate candidates. They can't get them.
Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
What do you mean the academy is taken over by wokus? Are we talking about the university system?
Yeah, yeah. Particularly universities, probably also high schools. I mean, I'm not in the lower education schools, but they're probably also taken over.
So you're saying that, because I've interviewed a variety of professors in this thing, and they'll all tell me, hey, I have had bias training. Can't be biased. I've had bias training. That makes me unbiased. So therefore, not an issue. At the
Oh,
other time, I've heard other people say, 95% or 97% of all professors in universities across America are basically liberal and definitely would never call themselves a conservative. Are you getting at something about that? What do you mean by this, Professor?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there are hardly any conservatives, right? There's like, almost everyone is a leftist. There's a few libertarians and like a tiny number of conservatives. So like that's one problem. But not only are they leftist, but it's sort of like um, the extreme progressive woke left is like the loudest voice. I don't know how many people actually subscribe to this sort of like extreme woke ideology because again, as I say, like it's the extremists that you're constantly hearing from. Okay, but like when your organization is sufficiently taken over by one ideology, then the small number of people who disagree shut up, and so then the people of the dominant ideology sort of become more and more extreme, and they start competing with each other to take more extreme positions because they've confused extremism in this ideology with loyalty to the group. So
Right.
essentially, they're trying to declare their loyalty to the group by coming up with more extreme left wing positions.
So you're an academic, you're a professor, you've worked in academia um, more than just 1 year, you've been around, and you're saying, I've kind of noticed how a lot of university professors are a little bit leftist. And even though they have bias training, and even though they'll say that I could never be biased, I
Well,
have training.
the bias training is all race and gender bias training. There's no
Oh,
there's no training to avoid political bias, right?
oh, I didn't know that.
they, yeah,
I'm not a professional academic. All I hear is I literally have interviewed a bunch of liberals who were professors who go, can't happen. We have bias training. So
so
can't
yeah.
happen.
I mean, first of all, like, you know, what's the evidence that bias training works? Come on,
I,
right?
that's why I do the show to find out.
I think there's so well, the concept of implicit bias has become very popular in recent years, and a bunch of companies, including universities, are doing implicit bias training to reduce your implicit bias. But basically, there's no evidence that this works. In studies that try to find the detection of that try to detect the effect of implicit bias training on actual prejudiced behavior, they can't find any effect. Right? And by the way, like
that's
even the training about race and gender bias, like they only care about bias against minorities and women, right? Nobody
right.
cares about
That's
bias against men or white people.
I've never heard that before, but that would make sense. I've never heard that before. All I've heard is bias training. I don't know exactly what's covered in it, but it would seem to make sense that that they're talking about classical forms of discrimination versus political discrimination, and maybe I think what you're saying is there's no training in bias training to make sure you're unbiased politically. It's
Yeah.
about other forms of bias training. Okay. Uh, and there's also no evidence that bias training works. And so maybe the academia is a little bit biased, even though they say that they aren't, given that 97% of them are basically of one political ideology. I've seen that statistic from many places. It's not
Yeah.
just someone's opinion. There's a
You
lot
know,
of evidence of that.
I
Has it
mean,
always? I'm sorry.
I'm skeptical that it's 97%. Um, I
Could
think,
may not be.
yeah, I mean, I think like there are very few conservatives, but there are probably a bunch of people who would consider themselves independents.
Sure.
It's got to be more than 3%. So,
Sure, sure. I don't know the number. I'm just saying some stuff that I've seen. I've
yeah, yeah,
seen, 70%, I've seen 95%. I've seen it's kind of hard to tell because it's not a very popular topic to discuss in general. I saw an LA Times article about 2 weeks ago where a professor was publishing original research on climate change. And in a blog post or a letter, he goes, okay, so I published this journal, but by the way, I didn't really put out all the conclusions that my research made because I wanted to make sure that my paper would get published. So I only put out conclusions that I knew the Academy would like so that they would publish it. And he said that publicly, and oh my God, shockwaves. Now
Yeah.
this is in climate science, so it's a little bit different from a social science. But he put it out there that maybe there's bias in academia, and that if you say the wrong things, you can't get your work published. Is that true at all, Professor, or
You
is
you
Professor
think?
Huntley crazy?
Could it be? Could it be that academics are human beings who have human motives similar to those of the entire rest of the world?
I know that seems funny, but if you're outside academia, people are trained to believe that all academics are, purists and only go where the data tells them and are
Yeah.
totally fair, and they don't
Well,
have these human biases. I've talked to a lot of professors here who say one of the most shocking conclusions that they've come to in political science research is that highly educated people can be just as biased as people who've never finished high school.
well, yeah. Well, look, I mean, in some ways, your
Shocking.
your education could work against you, right? So people who have a lot of knowledge and high intelligence can use that to rationalize sticking to the views that they prefer in the face of contrary evidence, right? So like people who are not very smart, when they come up with evidence that refutes their beliefs, they might actually be forced to change their beliefs. But if
Right.
you're very clever, then you can come up with ways, excuses for why you don't have to change your belief, and ways of criticizing that evidence or whatever. Right? And then if you have a lot of background information, you can just sort of like search through your mind for bits of information, search through selectively for only information that supports the thing you want to believe, right?
I'd never heard that, but that makes a lot of sense. I had heard this one thing about educated people can be as biased as those who never finished high school, but what you're saying makes a lot of sense. If all humans are motivated by things other than pure logic and reason or the rational man theory, uh, then yeah, if you have more resources at your disposal, like education, it'd be easier for you to dig yourself into a hole. Hey, I got a bigger shovel and I got a pickaxe.
Yeah,
I can
yeah,
dig this hole even bigger than someone who just has two hands.
yeah. I mean, if you're just trying to impartially find the truth, then greater intelligence and knowledge helps you get to the truth. But if you're trying to believe what you want to believe, then greater intelligence and knowledge lets you believe what you want to believe, right? It depends on what your initial motivation is, right? But I want to say about bias in publication. You have to understand that a lot of publication decisions are partly subjective, right? It's not completely subjective, but there's a subjective element. So you have to judge, like, and especially in philosophy, but this could happen in other fields too. You have to judge, like, well, how plausible is this, and how interesting is it? And that could just be very, subjective judgments like that can very easily be biased by your previous opinion, right? So, like,
Sure.
if you have a left wing orientation, then you're just going to have a tendency to find conservative ideas implausible, right? And
Right.
possibly even uninteresting, right?
Right. That's kind of what this other professor, I'll try to find the article, was out in LA Times, was getting at was, I had data. I could have made 4 or 5 points off the data. I made one instead because I knew it would be more politically acceptable and I wanted to get the paper published. And I was afraid if I listed all 4 or 5 things that the data actually showed, I would not get published because there would be additional points that may not be as popular. And that set off a firestorm because the public actually believes that academia is unbiased. Whether that's true or not, the public actually thinks you guys wear all like, I know you don't, but the picture is something like you wear all white lab coats and you just say what the data shows. And if it doesn't say that, and this idea that you are fallible humans like the rest of us, I honestly don't think the public gets. And
Uh,
when they see debate and they see bias in academia, they freeze up in terror because their opinion of you is you're a bunch of Greek scholars wearing togas walking around only interested in the truth and willing to throw yourself on your sword if you could ever say something wrong. And the idea that people want tenures and
Well,
promotions and book deals and to be more popular, and that humans are humans everywhere. And hey, my academic theory, if I say it this way, is going to be more popular in my local academia, and I'm more likely to get grant scholarships and funding and appear on TED Talks. That concept is not with the public, I found. As somebody
yeah.
who's from the public and interfaces with academia more, they don't get that. They really believe it's a bunch of Socrates walking around who could never be corrupted, and to
Well,
go,
I mean, I would guess it matters a lot which political party the people belong to. So
sure,
probably
sure.
if you talk to average Republicans, they're going to be
Yeah, yes, you're right. I'm talking to non-Republicans when I'm,
you know.
yes,
But I
absolutely.
mean, the Republicans probably have an exaggeratedly cynical view, and the Democrats have an exaggeratedly optimistic view. Right?
Fair enough, fair enough. My concern is that if so much of the research on political science is coming from one political side,
Yeah.
and we're dealing with the lowest level of trust we have in institutions in about half a century, according to Pew Research. And we as an entire country have to come together to solve this polarization. How do we get all the conservatives on board when they think all the liberal studies are biased against them? Let's say we
Uh,
got the magic answer. We know how to fix political polarization. I don't trust it because all of you guys are liberals. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not going to do it.
Um, I mean, on the face of it, it would seem like, well, we need more conservatives in the academy. um, like, what if we, I don't know, like we could have affirmative action for ideological diversity, right? Um, but I don't know how to make that happen, right? Because when the overwhelming majority of the people making hiring decisions are left wing, I don't know how to convince them that they should try to bring in people with other opinions, which they think the other opinions are just wrong opinions. Like
Right.
why would we mix together truth with falsehood?
Right.
Like why would we bring in people who are just factually just decisively wrong?
Right.
What do
Yeah.
we have to learn from them?
Yeah. It'd be the equivalent of saying, can we have someone come and talk about basket weaving more? Like, what's the point?
Yeah,
We don't need that. We don't need that. It's irrelevant. And at worst, it'll misinform our delicate students' minds.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Like, well, they might say like, well, you wouldn't bring somebody into a geology class to talk about the flat Earth theory,
right.
and
Yeah.
conservatism is just like that. Right?
I'm afraid it's getting there, and and that's not accurate.
Yeah, it's not like the flat Earth theory. No, that is an unfair
No,
take. Yeah,
well, and just even there's a variety of ideas in American history that are highly controversial, but they are quintessentially American. For example, my favorite thing is the debate on slavery. Slavery's wrong and horrible and bad and wrong, but America was built on the idea that it was totally cool. I mean, that's into our original founding documents, and they did it for better part of a century. And half these guys we worship as founding fathers were hardcore slave owners who didn't see a problem with it. That
yeah,
concept comes later. And so,
yeah.
which side do we teach? The side that was for more of our history and more of
Well,
our legal system said is cool, or do we teach the other side
yeah.
that's, oh, it's always this existential evil and we kind of knew it the whole time and we just were waiting to strike it down in the Civil War? I've always said that on President's Day, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln would never hang out with each other.
uh, I don't know.
So who's the good guy?
Um,
Who do we
well,
teach?
so I think my understanding is that slavery was controversial from the beginning. In the original version of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson had these clauses. So, there's a list of the grievances against King George, and one of them was that he allowed the transatlantic slave trade.
That's
Okay,
cool.
which
Yeah,
is hypocritical because Jefferson was a slave owner, but a
yeah.
hypocrite could be right, right?
True, true.
But anyway, but they took it out because they wanted to get the slave owning colonies to sign on.
Right.
So, and then And then there's this clause in the Constitution about how slavery couldn't be banned before a certain year or whatever. Um, but they put that in as a compromise because there were a bunch of people who wanted to ban it, and then the slave states were not going to join the Union or were not going to ratify the Constitution if it didn't protect slavery for this time period, right? And so, and by the way, note that they didn't actually use the word slavery. Like every time they want to say something about slavery, they make it an oblique reference to it.
Oh, oh,
Um, and I think it's
servitude.
it's sort of because they were embarrassed, right?
Uh,
And because they didn't want to sully this document about that's mostly about freedom and democracy.
that could be true, and that absolutely. I would argue that a lot of the people were slave owners at the original convention. A lot of the founding fathers were slave owners. They never got rid of slave owning. None of the founding fathers got rid of their slaves while they were alive. Only a few of them got rid of them after they were dead. So they didn't even have the bravery to release their slaves while they're alive. The only one that did that out of all the founding fathers was my personal favorite, Benjamin Franklin. Just one out of all these people who said that it's such a bad thing could ever actually be found to do the thing. And then we go back to the Civil War. Lincoln said, hey, if we can keep slavery around and keep the Union together, it's cool with me. It was after the Southerners said, no, 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 we don't want. That's when he started pounding down on them and go, well, I guess we got to release the slaves. That's not what he said at first. So there's definitely a line of America that says slavery's cool for a very, very long time with a lot of people involved in it.
Yeah,
And we see that as a debatable issue now on like, what is our role with slavery with the 1619 Commission and the various amount of controversy about that. I didn't
yeah.
really want to get into that. I just wanted to say, I love talking to you about bias. I wanted to ask you about this one. The Democratic Party was taken over by extremists just like the Republican Party. I have suspected this too,
Yeah.
but I have been told, Professor, no, no, no. Only the Republicans have become more extreme. I've literally seen a lot of academics and professors who study political science say Democrats basically haven't moved the needle in 30, 40 years. It's the Republicans by themselves, only them have become more extreme. Is that true in your opinion, Professor?
Um, no, I think the Democrats have become well. There's like extreme voices in the Democratic Party who have
Sure,
sort of like
sure,
taken outsized power and influence. Okay,
sure.
so and like so now what the left stands for is different from what it used to stand for. Like it used to be that freedom of speech was a left wing cause, and now it's become a right wing cause. And why did that happen? Because the wokeists want to shut up people who disagree with them, and so they decided that they can't support free speech anymore, right? But anyway, and then like the left used to be more concerned about like helping the poor or something like this, wealth redistribution. But now it's like you just keep hearing about race and gender, right? Okay, and how about some evidence of this? I don't know. So Joe Biden won. He won the nomination, and then he won the election largely because he was perceived as a moderate, which is to say that's why ordinary voters voted for him, right? And he was polling strongest against Donald Trump, which is, I think, why he got the nomination. However, then like he just does all this stuff to kowtow to the wokeists, right? So like
Yeah,
he promised that if he got a Supreme Court nomination, he would nominate a black
right,
woman. So he's just like explicitly announcing that race and gender is going to be the criterion, right, for the Supreme Court justice. So he does that. And then like his press secretary, another black woman, and then his vice president, another black woman.
right,
Like,
right.
okay, could it be more clear that he's not making decisions based upon, just like the job qualifications? He's making decisions based on race and sex.
I mean, I thought because I remember growing up and being told, well, African American people can't technically be racist because they don't have the agency or the power structure to be able to force discrimination on others. It can only be enforced on them. So therefore, they can't ever be racist. And I thought, I don't really buy that because I'm Mexican and I've always known minorities can be just as racist as the most racist white people. I've seen racist Asian people. I've seen racist African American people against Asians. I've seen it personally, and as a Latino, I know I had my abuelita. I love her, but she would say some pretty nasty things about Southeast Asians, and it was not cool with me. So I know that minorities can be racist. I've seen it. It's wrong. It's disgusting. Racism is disgusting by all people, and discrimination is wrong. It's always been that way. But
Yeah,
I
yeah,
thought, okay, well, let's say that definition is correct for a minute. When the president of America says, and his vice president is African American, a lot of staff people are African American. His campaign manager was famously an African American, I believe, lesbian woman, very vocal. Um, and I'm only going to hire a black woman. I'm like, well, the agency test is met then. I mean, if you have that many African American people in power, and you have the president of America saying, I'm not going to pick anybody but an African American person, you can't say we don't have agency or power to influence the structure to make sure that we get the prime spot. You just can't. That's gone. Now, maybe that's the right thing to do, but it also means, okay, well, now you are being a little racist by definition because you're using the system to specifically benefit your race instead of others. I thought we were trying to get away from that.
Well, I mean, it's more like the white people who are racist against other white people, right? It's like Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the one who's a racist, right? Because he's the one who's saying, he has to pick a black woman, even though he's not black, right? But
Right.
you could be prejudiced against your own race, you know.
I guess that's true. I remember thinking when they left, when they took the African American LGBTQ star from Russia, which was good, and it wasn't okay that she was there. But they left the white guy, who was a Marine. He
Yeah, yeah,
wasn't a minority. He wasn't LGBTQ. And he almost got no coverage in the media. It was all a big celebration about how this sports star who's a minority in LGBTQ came back. And you barely heard any mention of this Marine who
yeah.
was willing to risk his life for our security and was left behind willingly for political convenience. And I thought, isn't that interesting too? Because
Well,
that's a lack of agency, also.
yeah. So the thing is, like, it was covered on conservative media, but not on liberal media.
Right. Which that's bad. I would think
Yeah,
there was a time in America where we would mourn collectively for
yeah,
leaving one of our soldiers, Marines, airmen, or Coast Guard behind.
yeah. So, I mean, like, if Joe Biden loses the next election, which is, pretty likely, I mean, it's about 50-50. It's unclear who's going to win. But, if he loses, it's going to be partly because he no longer looks like a moderate because of stuff like this. It's like, it's just like so clear that he's making decisions based upon, people's identity group characteristics,
Yeah,
which is very un-American, right? I mean,
I think to the
I
level
thought
he's
we
doing.
rejected that.
I think yeah. I think we always stood for, well, in the recent times, I think Americans' conception of America is standing for diversity, but picking to this point, yeah, I think it's egregious. And also, I mean, the guy went to Charlemagne the God, a hip hop African American radio station. The man is well thought of as in the community, and he said, if you're not voting for me, you ain't black. I mean, that is the most racist, discriminatory, backwards ass thing that I've heard. And he got a complete and total pass for it. And it's insane. It's insane to me, like how you can do that. I think he also said, Jewish, I'm not making this up, Jewish people basically control the media, but that's great because they've popularized diversity in their control. And he got a total pass for that, which is a discriminatory, racist trope that goes back to the 30s. And he got a pass for that too. So, yeah, I totally agree with you. The guy's bad. I thought we were trying to get rid of people who were clods and didn't understand diversity. Not sure. What other ways do you think? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, Well, it used to be like back in the civil rights movement, the ideal was that you would judge people based on the content of their character and not the
Right.
color of their skin. And now we've just gone all the way to the other side. Like, it used to be, oh, only white people are good and black people are bad. And then I thought we arrived at the consensus that your skin color doesn't matter, but now we've gone to the opposite extreme, like white people are bad, black people are good.
I I don't think there's necessarily a concerted effort to say white people are bad. I do get what you're saying. I have seen some TikTok videos where they're asking young people, if I say black person, what do you think? And they go, oh, cool, friendly. And they go, if I say white person, what do you think? Racist, discriminatory, bad history. And it's just like a little survey they're doing on the streets just for giggles and fun. And that's not hard data, but it is the youth. I keep noticing these videos with people who are in their 20s or in their teens, and I'm like, I'm not sure that's a good message either. I don't think it's accurate.
No,
Um, and I don't think teaching the youth it's okay, because there was this group called the Nazis, and they had this idea of if we can find a group of people to pick on and say they're bad, that brings all of us together. And I remember watching this documentary. The Japanese Empire was invited personally by Hitler to go and visit, and they visited Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan. And when they got back to Imperial Japan, they go, you know what? Those Nazis really have their act together. We in Imperial Japan could learn something from them and become even more organized and more totalitarian. The problem is we don't have any Jews. I'm not making this up. This is literally a report. They go, we don't have any minorities in Japan. If we had a little minority group we could point out and go, it's those guys there. They literally said this, and this was literally one of the key pieces of the Nazi ideology. We can find a common enemy for everybody. It's a small minority, so we can get most people around it. They will focus their hate on that, and that will bring us together, and they'll stop criticizing my government because I already told you who the problem is. So now here we are again. We need to bring this diverse collection of different peoples and ethnicities together. How do we do that? We need a new bad guy. Well, we can't do any of the old tropes because that's racist. White people, you're the new bad guy. You're the evil one. We're going to focus on you, and you're going to pull the country back together. Now, nobody's officially said that, but yeah, I can see what you're talking about. And
what
we've
could
seen this
possibly go wrong?
right. Exactly. Thank you. What can possibly go wrong when we single out a particular group for abuse and say it's okay to abuse this one particular group? How could that possibly go bad?
Now, I
Right.
don't know how this is going to go because in the past, nobody has tried to scapegoat the majority. You know, like that. I don't think that's going to work very well. And, it never goes well, right? Okay, but I know something weird is going to happen.
Well, yeah, yeah. So technically, Caucasian adults are the majority of adults, but Caucasian children are now a minority of children.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we won't get to where there's a majority of minority voters, children who are now old enough to vote till 2045. So we
Yeah.
got about 20 more years. So the problem is we're right in the shift. Okay, there's more minority babies, but there's more Caucasian voters. So we're right in this 20-year shift where it's going to be shifting. And when you have one group demonize the other during a population shift where one group's majority and they're starting to go to slightly minority, you typically have these things called civil wars, like we saw in a place called Rwanda and a place called Fiji, where you had two different ethnic groups. One was a majority ethnic group, like 60% of the population. And the moment they started slipping in population, we were 60, now we're 58, now we're 57, now we're 55. They started to get a lot more violent.
Yeah.
Because they were losing power. Also, the other minority realized we're coming up in power. So maybe we can act even more violent to them because there's more of us. And it wasn't until you got that population shift balanced the other way that it ended.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, I imagine the left is saying, well, we're just telling the truth, about history, about all the
Right.
bad things white people have done. And the thing is, like, if we were teaching the lesson that, well, human beings are bad, right? Like, human beings have a dark core in
Right.
our souls.
Right.
I think that is a valid and useful lesson.
Yeah.
Okay, but if it's all about the bad things white people have done, then I think people are getting the wrong message, right?
I
And
wonder.
and that just stimulates tribalism and hate, right? But and that's not true, right? I mean, white people are not worse than other people. The reason why white people
No.
the reason why white people were enslaving others, it was just that we just had more power and money, okay? But like, every people in most of history, every people would have enslaved the rest of the world if they could. Just not most of them.
Slavery existed all over throughout human history. True. We made a more extreme version of it here in America after the fall of Haiti, called chattel slavery. But what's also true is that most white people in America never actually owned a slave. It's a
Yeah,
small percentage of Caucasian people who ever actually owned one, and that includes in the South. And there was slavery in the North. And a
yeah,
lot of people like to forget there was slavery in the North for a very long time. And they like to bring up the abolitionists. The abolitionists were no more than 2% of the population in the North.
yeah.
No more than 2%. So all this talk about how the North was enlightened, no, it wasn't. What they were worried about was white men competing with black men for labor. So they didn't want slavery so they could keep jobs, not because they loved black people and realized there was a problem with the Constitution and it was unfair. It was about, you're taking my jobs. It's the same thing they say against the Mexicans coming up. They're taking our jobs. So a lot of the Northerners who were backing Lincoln and his pledge to not expand slavery into the Western territories had absolutely nothing to do with seeing black people as equal. It was about making sure they couldn't take my job so I could get out to the West and claim that territory and develop it all for myself. So there was a very small percentage of America that was like slavery's bad because it's bad, even at the time of Lincoln. And that story's lost. And instead, what we have is the North was enlightened. Everybody understood it was wrong. Lincoln understood from the time he was a baby that it was wrong. And we had to fix this. And that's a fairy tale. That's not true. It didn't happen that way.
Well, yeah. So like, I would like to see, if they had polls back then, I'd like to see the polling data. So I expect that there were probably people in both the North and the South who were against it, but also, like, they were against it, but they weren't that much against it,
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah,
right? But
yeah,
that's like a lot of it's like a lot of stuff today. Okay, when people hear about some horrible thing that's going on, they're against it, but they're not that much against it.
right, right. I'll tell someone how upset it makes me, but that's it. I'm not going to donate. I'm not going to volunteer. I won't go out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keyboard warriors. Uh, when do you think it started to get bad? As we're winding down here, I want to ask you, as a professor, but also as an American with two working eyeballs who's been alive for a while. I know that you weren't there in the 1960s like me. When did you started to notice things get bad? This is a question I ask a lot of professors where you're like, oh man, it wasn't like that before. I remember last year when we had our pumpkin pie festival, people were more civil, and this year now it's different. Was there a time when you noticed things got different? Are we talking 2004 with George Bush? Are we talking 2016 with Trump? Maybe it goes back to the 90s. When did you personally notice something and go, oh, that's bad, that's different, we're heading in a different way now? When did that happen, that first
um,
inclination happen to you?
I don't know. I mean, I think, like, in the last 10 years, we've gotten more polarization, and I'm thinking that has to do with the rise of social media companies. That's one thing. Things got, like, especially heated after 2016 with the Trump campaign, right? Because he's a very polarizing figure, and, like, the Democrats absolutely hate him, and then there's a large portion of Republicans who are just like fanatical followers, right? So that's part of it. So, like, partly he stimulated a reaction from the left, but it's kind of mutual, right? Because the extreme wokeists are stimulating a reaction from the right. When you see the other side being crazy, it makes you crazier.
That's brilliant.
I started to notice stuff like, well, so I think the Me Too movement started around 2012, and I think that was maybe stimulated by this letter that the Department of Education sent out to all of the universities. And so the education department sent out this letter saying that when you have complaints of sexual harassment or sexual assault, you have to use a preponderance of the evidence standard, not a reasonable doubt standard. Right. So they were making it, preponderance of the evidence, meaning if it's more than 50% likely that the person did it, then you should find that they did it. You should punish them. Right. And so like the education department, Obama's education department, just like basically forced all the universities to greatly lower the standard of evidence, thus making it so that more people could be convicted. Okay, my sense was that was around the time that Me Too started. Well, then the Me Too movement it just got replaced by the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And like that was, it appears, largely because of George Floyd.
I want to get this down. Trump stimulated the left, but the right was stimulated by the extreme left wokeism.
Yeah. They're both sort of like provoking each other.
And you said things were getting bad for about 10 years. What year did this Obama letter come out?
So I think it was either 2011 or 2012, something like that.
Department of Education letter.
Yeah, it's referred to as the Dear Colleague letter, right? Because that's how it begins.
Holy shit. There it is. Well, I'm sorry. Whoops. Should have said that. I apologize. Wow, there's a great equalizer. The department is determined. Oh, wow. So when this letter came out, the Dear Colleague letter, 2011, let me find, I'm going to show everybody this right here. This helped change the way that universities across America had to deal with sexual assault. Is that right?
Yes. So when they get accusations of sexual harassment or assault, the universities have to do an investigation. Otherwise, they could be found to be violating, Title IX and being discriminatory.
Wow. It's called the
Yeah.
Dear.
Right. Yeah. So during the Trump administration, the Trump's education department rescinded that and said, no, you can use whatever standard of evidence you want. But I think the damage had already been done. Right. And they didn't say you have to go to the reasonable doubt standard. They just said, we take back what we said before. And so I think the universities basically just stayed. Right. They stayed with the preponderance of evidence that they'd gotten from the Obama administration.
Wow. I didn't. Okay. So that moved it from preponderance of evidence is not enough it moved it to preponderance of evidence from.
Oh, yeah. So, there's said to be like an intermediary standard of evidence of clear and convincing evidence, which is
Right.
below reasonable doubt, but more than preponderance of evidence. So some schools, I think, were using that. But then, after this Dear Colleague letter, they all have to go to preponderance of the evidence, meaning if it's 51% likely that the person did what they're accused of, then you can find them guilty.
And they were getting rid of the old rule, which was.
Yeah. So I don't know how uniform it was. I don't know if most universities were using reasonable doubt or clear and convincing evidence.
That was it. Reasonable doubt. Sorry, I was looking for the phrase.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. And so, was there polarization before Donald Trump in 2016? Did you notice any? When I asked you, you said maybe the last 10 years. Did it all
Yeah.
start with Trump? Did you notice anything before Trump?
Well, so like I feel like there's sort of increasing strife maybe during the Obama administration, um, but I feel like it intensified in 2016 and
Okay.
thereafter.
Okay.
Well, okay, so during the Bush administration, a bunch of people hated George W. Bush,
Right.
but I feel like that's nothing compared to the way they hate Trump. Like, and okay, but then like the people on the right, like a bunch of people were really upset when Obama was elected, and so I feel like that was more than they were normally upset about Democratic presidents. And there's this stuff about how like, oh, maybe he was born in Kenya. That's the sort of um, personal attack, not policy attack. That so sort of when you start doing that, you're going down a bad path, right?
Right. Right. Um, right. That's interesting. Uh, that's interesting. So I remember I participated in some of the protests against Bush at the time. I was against the Iraq War, and you're right. I think the level of hate they had against Trump is worse than Bush. And I remember when Bush was there, it was pretty bad. I'd never seen a president hated that much ever before. Um, I was against Iraq. A lot of my friends were just hated him, and I was like, wow, that's a little extreme. And then it got worse with Obama. It was a level of hate I'd never seen before, and then it got even higher with Trump. And Trump beats Bush. So yeah, I totally agree. There seems to be this ever escalating increase of hate against the president. Like it just goes to new levels we've never seen before. Biden's not worse than Trump, but maybe we'll get another president who ignites America's anger to levels we've never seen before by these previous three.
Yeah,
It's a troubling trend.
Yeah, it's worth looking back at what debates used to be like. Like
Right.
Look at a clip of Reagan versus Carter debating, and then look at a clip of Donald Trump debating. It's just completely different, right? Like the worst thing Ronald Reagan says is, "There you go again."
Right. Right. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Yeah. He did. It was. And Reagan did pick on Democrats. Famously, he'd make fun of them, but he'd also work with them at the end of the day, and we seem to have lost that. And you're right. Even then there was some civility. I think the worst thing he did was it Mondale or someone said, Ronald Reagan is the oldest person running for office or something like that. And then Reagan responded on the debate stage with, I am not going to lower myself to bringing up my counterparts' youthful naivete and inexperience as part of this campaign, and that's wrong for anyone to do. And everybody laughed, and but that was his worst slam.
It was a good comeback. Yeah.
It was a good comeback, but it was not. He has small hands, or somebody should punch him. It was he's naive, and he's inexperienced in a funny way. That was as bad as it got. You're right. The language is.
I think so. I have the sense that Newt Gingrich sort of increased the level of partisan polarization, right? Like, it was part of his project to just like attack Democrats, right? And impeaching Bill Clinton for having an affair, right? Which was not officially what he was impeached for. He was officially impeached for lying about the affair. But come on,
Yeah, we all know. Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence showing that. As I've been researching, there's a lot of evidence showing that political polarization, as we understand it, really did start in the 1990s, like what you're saying. And one of the primary, most likely culprits is Newt Gingrich. If you have to, it's hard to identify, pin it to like a individual, but if you had to, Newt Gingrich definitely put us on the wrong track as an entire country. And the repercussions of those actions he made in the 1990s are still with us today, and they're very dramatic. If you look at the polarization between the sitting members, it started with him.
Yeah, I mean, a good comparison is the Nixon impeachment versus the Clinton impeachment and later, right? Because well, Nixon had to resign, and he had to resign because the Republicans went to him and told him that he had to resign because they were going to vote to convict him, right? And like once the evidence came out, like there were because Nixon made these tapes, and there are these tapes of him talking about his, conspiring to bribe people to keep quiet about Watergate. So once the tapes come out, like the Republicans were not going to support him; they were going to vote to convict him, and that's why he had to resign. Okay, but then later you get the Clinton impeachment, and it just totally breaks down on partisan lines.
I
Like
heard
all of
that.
the people voting to convict are Republicans, right? And then like with the Trump impeachment, it's just like completely partisan, right? It just all the Democrats on one side and all the Republicans on the other side.
That's a good point. With Clinton's impeachment, there was big polarization by party, and that is a time where you can go back and go, do we ever have a time in the past where the parties were really, really divided with each other? Clinton's impeachment, absolutely, and it was almost down to a party vote. I think maybe there was one or two who didn't do that, but almost all Democrats stood with him, despite the evidence that he actually did commit a crime. Yes, I understand they were trying to get him for cheating on his wife. He did technically commit the crime of perjury or not saying information correctly. But it was also like a trick to get him, and I think everybody saw that. But technically, there was something there, but it didn't matter. There was no nuance from Democrats. They're like, this is just wrong. And then Republicans said, well, I'll line up behind he's got to go. So it's an early point 3 decades ago that we can point to say, that's different. That's bad that the party's so split dramatically and holistically. Every Democrat on this side, every Republican on this side. And it's only become more like that over time. That might have been one of the first instances where we saw that in the modern era.
Yeah.
Uh, I thank you, because I'm in California, and a lot of people said, "Well, we were perfect, and then Trump came, and he made it all bad." And I never really bought that. So I like hearing about how, the way people hated Trump was Bush was pretty bad, and then it got to Obama was another level, and then we got the Trump, and it was even higher. That lets us know that there's kind of a continuance. It didn't just start with Trump. There's been problems brewing from before.
Yeah.
How do
Yeah. I
we
mean, I
feel?
do feel like Trump is something special. I think he's
Oh yeah,
unlike any other figure.
I agree. But there's this theory that we lived in a perfect state of nature, and then he came and he by himself made everything messed up, rather than
We were in
we
the Garden of Eden,
yeah, we were in the Garden of
and the
Eden,
serpent showed up.
yeah, picking fruit, everything's tasty, and then one day Trump comes and the fruit trees start dying on the vine, rather than the fruit trees were already starting to die on the vine. We didn't pay attention. We had goats in our garden eating part of the fruit. We didn't pay attention. And then Trump showed up. And because with all three of those factors, he was too much pressure and started to collapse the thing. But there were problems before we just didn't really pay attention to because it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my theory. Is
No, yeah, that's fair. I think um, I I have more of a sense of the role of academia than most people do. Which might be a bias, or it might just be I have more knowledge. Like I think part of our problem is, well, there's a whole bunch of people who are like full-time intellectuals, and a bunch of them are just devoting their time to coming up with ways of attacking America, like just coming up with theories about really sort of like invidious, divisive theories, right? About how one group is oppressing another group. And so, like, there are all these people just trying to come up with ways that men are oppressing women, new ways, that you didn't think of, so that you see something that you thought was perfectly innocent. You're like, aha, now I see that that's oppression, right? And new ways that white people are oppressing black people and et cetera, right? So, like, And there are people who just like, it's like their job to do that. And they're like, they're resourceful people, right? They're people with high IQs and like lots of education, and they're devoted to creating the kinds of theories that divide a society.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Pursuing theories that divide people. Exposing new forms of discrimination. Oh, yeah, I've seen that. I saw one now where, and I have some family members who are obese, and I'm very sympathetic to it, and I totally sympathetic, and I too was obese when I was younger, and it's a tough issue, and I'm very sympathetic to it. But I've started to see this thing where they call it fat phobic. So now it's, if you're telling people you should exercise, if you're telling people you need to diet, that's not promoting health, that's discrimination. And
Yeah.
you are actively hating on a group of people who are fat people, as they call themselves. And you are now, therefore, fat phobic. And all of this talk came out about a year after the word transphobic became very popular. And then you immediately saw, okay, well, now if you're transphobic, now you're fat phobic. And then right after you start seeing this popularized, well, then you start seeing academic studies who go, oh, we proved it. We proved it. It's real. So here's a new form of discrimination. Here's a new bad guy. Here's a new bad group of people. Here's a new reason for you to feel like you're a victim, and those are the bad people who are holding you down. And yeah, I never thought about it like that, but we do seem to find some new group who's a victim every year, and maybe some of them are. Maybe some of them are, and maybe they do need justice and being exposed. But it is interesting that we seem to keep finding a new group every year. Is that
Yeah.
necessary?
Yeah. Well, like in the academic world, to get published and to have people pay attention to you, you want to say something novel.
Right.
Right. And so, okay, but yeah, but if you're working within this kind of woke left-wing paradigm, then how do you say something novel? Well, you got to find new forms of discrimination and oppression, and new oppressed groups, or right, new things that people thought were innocent that actually turn out to be oppression.
I work in climate change for my day job. And one of the things that I found alarming is that occasionally there will be climate change studies that are repealed from academic journals. They were published, and then they go, actually, the research wasn't good enough to prove the headline. And I keep thinking, well, how to get published anyways? I thought you guys were peer reviewing these things before they got published. Why is it that
Yeah.
it occasionally keeps popping up that, oh, we shouldn't have published that?
No, you
Whoops.
got yeah, you got to think about how things work with real human beings, right? So this is the way it works. Okay, so in philosophy we don't have data, so it doesn't doesn't
Right.
matter. So we don't have to retract anything, even when we're wrong. But look, this is what happens. I get an email from some journal that says we would like you to please review this, and I have a lot of things to do. Okay, and you know how much money they're offering me to do this? Zero, $0 and 0 cents.
Right.
Okay, so okay, so I'll do it just to be nice, sometimes, right? So, okay. And I do more than most people do. But anyway, you're like, okay, so I got to review this thing for nothing. I get nothing out of this. So, exactly how careful am I going to be in reviewing this, right? Am I going to read through all of their data? Like, no, I'm going to assume the data is true. I'm going to assume that they didn't make anything up and like there aren't any egregious errors. And then I'm just going to read the text that they gave me to see if it makes sense and is interesting, right?
You're right.
And so, and even when so like occasionally somebody actually falsifies. Occasionally they actually just put in false data. I assume that's rare, but even when they're not doing that, just like a lot of stuff that people find is not true. Right. And that, like a lot of studies, if you attempt to replicate them, it turns out that you can't replicate them. Right. So somebody found this amazing thing, right, doing this study, and then somebody else does the same, they do the same experiment and they don't get the same result. And that actually happens most of the time in social psychology, right? And we don't know how often it happens just in general, because like most fields have not done a systematic effort to find out, how often their results replicate.
Just I just find it interesting that there's because what it appears to me is that academia is awesome, and it's a lot of people who are trying to do good, trying to help bring light into the universe, although they have biases. Um, but that the public views them as almost robots who don't have human emotions and don't have human motivations and don't have human biases and don't have prejudice or anger or disgust in their hearts. It's just a pure quest for knowledge. And I'm finding that the public image of academia doesn't actually match with reality.
Yeah, I mean, like people in every profession are people, like
Right.
they're selfish. They, and academics, people in different professions on average have sort of like a little bit different values. They're not going to be radically different, right? But like, people in academia have more intellectual curiosity than people in other professions. People in politics have more desire for power than people in other professions, right? And if you're a businessman, you probably have more desire for money. Okay, so there are differences in people's values, but still, we're human beings, we're flawed, and like if you're in the academy, you want to succeed, right? You want to find out the truth, but you also want prestige and recognition from your peers, and you want to be in a good university, right? Like get a good job and stuff like that. And so you just gotta take account of how people work, right?
Fair enough. Fair enough. And this is one of the debates I always get myself into when I complain about problems in society, and they go, well, what would you do? And I go, well, I do it the same way. I just be honest about it. The same way. Yeah, you're right. Okay, I understand. People have flaws. Let's start getting the public to be aware of that. Instead of viewing academia as these people who can't make mistakes and are unbiased robots who always go after the pure truth, let's recognize there are groups of humans, and sometimes they have biases and make mistakes too. And just because a group of academics got together and said this is the truth, maybe we should take a step and think about it before we just accept that information.
Yeah.
What I'm seeing now is, which I would call healthy skepticism. What I'm afraid of deeply is what I'm seeing now is, oh, did an academic say it? Okay, let's just accept it. Oh, did an academic say it? Oh, let's just reject it.
Yeah.
So there's no, I will
Yeah.
accept with healthy skepticism and checking. It's, I love you. I don't need to double check anything you say. Just give it to me. I just absorb it right. Or
Yeah.
I don't want anything you have to do. I don't care how good your data is. I want, and one's conservative, one's liberal. And why can't we get to a spot where we all kind of go, you guys said what? I'm going to take a second look at that before I accept that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's too
Yeah.
polarized sides.
Yeah, you got to be more subtle, right? Like, we get some things right, we get some things wrong. Okay, we're not
Yeah.
always right, we're not always wrong.
Yeah.
And I think like particularly when there are obvious political implications, that's when you should be particularly careful about the possibility of bias. And so, right. So like, somebody's just doing like medical research on some non-political topic, there's probably not going to be that much bias, right?
Right.
Unless this is a person who's going to profit from a medical treatment or whatever. Okay, then there's
Sure.
bias. But
Sure.
anyway, it's just an academic. They're not that biased, but they're doing research that's like clearly related to some political ideological point. Then there's a big potential for bias. You just got to recognize that.
This is the study for everybody that I was mentioning in the LA Times. The name of the article is "The Climate Scientists Want to Start a Debate in Academia, Set Off a Bigger Firestorm." Days after publishing research that found global warming had boosted the risk of fast-growing wildfires by 25%, scientist and lead author Patrick T. Brown announced that he'd withheld the full truth to maximize the article's chances of being published in the journal Nature. Quote, the paper I just published, Climate Warning Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California, focused exclusively on how climate change has affected extreme wildfire behavior. I knew not to try to quantify key aspects other than climate change in my research because it would dilute the story that prestigious journals like Nature and its rival Science want to tell. So wrote Brown, co-director of the Climate and Energy team at the Breakthrough Institute in Berkeley, super mega liberal university, super mega liberal professor at mega liberal university saying, I
So,
self-censor.
so the part that he didn't include was other factors that affect the wildfires. Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, I think what he's getting at is there was some evidence dealing with wildfires that would back up our traditional thoughts of climate change. And there was some evidence with wildfires that would not back up our traditional understanding of climate change. And so he went with and published only the evidence that went along with conclusions everybody was comfortable with. And he had other conclusions he could have made that he chose not to make, even though the evidence was there, because he thought it might make his paper not get published.
Right. Yeah. So I'm getting that like there were other causes of the wildfires that he didn't mention.
Could have been, yeah.
Now I don't know what they are, but maybe that's in the article. And yeah, I mean, maybe some of these other causes would have been less popular to complain about, right?
Sure, absolutely. It is an example of an academic, though, saying I self-censored. I could have made additional truthful observations based upon just looking at what the data showed. Maybe they would be controversial theories. Maybe they would be proven wrong. But science, as I understand, traditionally was a study of here's what the data shows. I'm going to express that. And then my peers can test if that's true or not, right? Peer-reviewed journals. This is, I could make 5 truthful statements. I'm only going to make 1.
Yeah.
Not because the data is not there, not because I can't prove it, strictly for political reasons.
Yeah.
And that's not science. That's politics. And he kind of opened Pandora's box and let everybody see inside academia. And boy, is he getting trashed by a lot of people in academia who weren't very happy that he did that.
Yeah. Well, like I've run into other examples and just cases where you have academics talking about how some research could be used by conservatives and sort of talking about that as a reason to not do the research or not publicize it or something like that, or not to criticize, reasons for not criticizing somebody's research because your criticism could be seized upon by conservatives, right? And when I hear that, I think, oh, well, that means that I can't trust you, right? Because you're modifying what you say in order to try to support left-wing views, right? Like, okay, so when you say something that appears to support liberal policies, that means that I shouldn't trust that because you're deliberately trying to avoid supporting conservative policies.
I have seen that.
And then, like this happened with some of the research on, the implicit association test, right? And then there's some people who are just like making criticisms of the implicit association test as a test of prejudice. And then like Mazarin Banaji complained that this could be used by conservatives or something like this, and you should
I read write, yes, exactly.
I shouldn't write popular articles about this because the public might start doubting, the narrative that I put forward.
And I started the research on political polarization, and I just wanted to understand the issue. And a lot of the academics who work in the space have been awesome and are just trying to understand. But at the same time, I kept noticing these little pesky other points like, are we getting the unvarnished truth? Is it what's actually existing out there? Or are we getting truth from people who are trying their best but are as flawed as the rest of us? And does the public know that? Or do they think they're getting basically the word of God? Super pure, No bias there at all. Straight up what it is, no interpretation at all. And I think the people aren't aware of that. And again, the problem I see is,
Yeah, yeah,
what if we actually come up with a solution to political polarization? We do all this research and study and dialogue, and at some point in the future or in the near future, we come up with one. We go, okay, we figured this out as Americans. Everybody comes to agree. This is the solution. And it is, and it will work. And it's a brilliant breakthrough. It's such a brilliant breakthrough. They're going to be talking about this for 300 years in the future. Here's the problem: 78%, 78 million Americans were told they're enemies of the state. They'll have nothing to do with whatever you're
yeah.
suggesting
No, that's right.
because you told
You
them
know,
it's evil.
the lesson of the little boy who cried wolf, right?
Yeah,
Well, it's sort of like, well, if you lie too many times, and people don't trust you when you're telling the truth, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so, and so if academics make biased statements too many times, and even when we're being unbiased and telling the truth, right, then people won't believe us. Like, um, this thing that Anthony Fauci did, where
right.
like he said, um, ordinary people don't need masks.
Yep,
Masks are only good for medical personnel,
yep,
right? Which didn't make any sense to begin with.
yep,
Okay. And then, 6 months later, he's like, yeah, everybody needs a mask.
yeah,
Like, okay,
yeah,
well, why did you say that? And then he's like, well, I lied.
yeah,
Okay. I lied because I thought that, the lie would be more beneficial than telling the truth.
yeah.
Okay. Then why should we believe you now?
Thank you. Thank you.
Right?
Thank you. I've had this debate with other people. No, I'm not an anti vaxxer. Yes, COVID was real. The
Yeah.
debate is on, why are all these Republicans not going along with the with the program on COVID? They just must be stupid and dumb and sociopaths. And I'm like, well, maybe the guy running the whole thing lied right to their face. People they knew died because they didn't cover their face with the mask. And then he comes back and goes, well, what I meant was the mask works. If I had a grandmother die during that time because I didn't get her mask because I followed what Fauci said, I would never listen to him again, ever. When I say that to fellow liberals, it just goes dead quiet. There's nothing to say.
Yeah.
But when I
Crickets.
bring up, remember that time when I go, well, do you have any reason to think why conservatives might doubt him? No, he's a god. I can't see any. Do you remember that time he lied to our? I have to remind liberals, fellow liberals, I have to go, yeah, but wasn't there that time he lied to our face about the mask? I have to remind people, and they go, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was that one time. That's after they were saying all these conservatives are crazy for having doubts. Then
Yeah.
I have to remind them of they were lied to by their face. And then they recall that. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that's interesting that you are willing to say all these conservatives are just crazy and stupid and backwards for no good reason. And you kind of forgot that the guy running the show literally lied to people's face on national TV in a manner that got some of them dead. That
Yeah.
would cause, I don't think that's a, I didn't share the level of skepticism of my conservative colleagues, but I didn't think it was crazy and stupid to have questions and be concerned about where the information was coming from and how authentic it was, given that you were lied to.
Yeah. And so like, okay, so the reason for telling the noble lie, so to speak,
Right.
was it was a policy objective, right? Like,
Sure.
so he was governed not by telling what he thought was true, but he wanted to tell what he thought would cause the right outcome for society. Okay, but that means that maybe he does that all the time.
I,
Also, maybe my views about what's good for society are not the same as his. So now, right? So now then I shouldn't listen to him because right, because what he's saying is what he thinks is good for society to believe,
right. Right.
but it might not be according to my values. So
Right. And maybe he's a medical doctor and not an expert in crisis management, because any expert in crisis management would have told you public trust of the officials while you're telling people what to do in the middle of an emergency is the number one most important thing, because the moment that's gone, you have nothing but chaos. And his actions seem to suggest he's not a man who understood how to handle mass catastrophes. But really, he was just a medical doctor who's brilliant, but he made a lot. He's just thinking logically, like, oh, we need more masks. How do we keep more masks? I know, I'll just tell them they don't need it. Yeah, and then you destroy public trust. Do you have any idea of how calamities are dealt with or FEMA emergencies or anything? Because that's mistake number one. And everybody who works in that field knows that. So clearly you did it. So clearly maybe you're not the best person for the job. But
Yeah,
in the middle of the couldn't say that.
by the way, this sort of like affects the media too, right? So like, now we can't trust the media, right? The other big thing I remember was when I first heard about the lab leak theory. Now going off into the conspiracy theories.
Thank you. Thank you.
When I first heard about it, I thought, oh yeah, that sounds stupid, because the version that I heard was that it was a bioweapon. COVID-19 was a bioweapon. I thought that's stupid because this is a shitty bioweapon. It would be a lot more deadly, right? But anyway, then people were saying, "Oh, that's racist."
Yeah.
I think it was a lab leak is racist, and there's no reason for thinking that. And then a bunch of scientists signed this like open letter saying that they rejected the lab leak theory, and there was no evidence for it.
Sure.
Okay, but what later turned out was they were just saying that for political reasons. They didn't have any evidence. And then it later turned out that actually there's pretty good evidence that it was a lab leak, right?
So we have a bunch of scientists who lied to our face, is what I just heard.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't, it wasn't that they knew it was a lab leak. It was that they didn't know, and they pretended to know.
Right, which is not science.
So that means, that means now we can't trust scientists.
Right? That's as I understand, that's not science. To just go, I feel and I want this to be the conclusion, so I'll just say that it is, rather than having actual data to prove that point.
Yeah, right. But so they were appealing to their authority as scientists, but they were motivated by politics. And so now that means that when you hear somebody appealing to the authority of scientists, you don't know whether they're actually relying on science or they're just relying on their political opinions.
Another one that I heard was during COVID-19 with the BLM protests. And yes, George Floyd was murdered. And there was an absolute problem with police brutality and excessive murders, primarily young African-American men, sometimes African-American women. Also, Latin people.
Also white people.
Also white people, but
white people are not being covered, but there are more white people than black people.
True, but per capita, there's a higher amount for black people, and in certain cities in California, blacks and Latinos. My problem was that the World Health Organization, a collection of scientists, just said, global pandemic, everybody, you're going to die. Stay indoors, don't go mingle, don't go out, social distancing. And then a week after George Floyd died, they said, go ahead and get out in the streets, BLM, and hang out with each other. The total opposite of their instructions a week prior. That convinces people to believe that organizations like the World Health Organization are making decisions based on politics and not science. And yet when I talk to fellow liberals about vaccine hesitancy, which I don't support, and they go, well, all these conservatives are vaccine hesitant because they're just crazy. And I go, well, what about this time where the World Health Organization, the experts were supposed to believe in this, totally contradicted the statement they made only a week before? Does that lead you to go, these are people I can believe and trust? Or does it look like they're schizophrenic?
Yeah. Well, they're not either. They're political ideologues, right? So
not science.
Yeah.
Right. That's not.
Yeah. I mean, like, they probably know the scientific truth, but they're not necessarily going to say it, right? They're going to say what they think is politically useful. So,
which means they're a politician.
But, as a side point, I want to take the opportunity to debunk the myth of racial bias in police killings, right?
Sure.
So, if you look at police killings per contact, it's higher for white people than black people. That is, given that the police make contact with a suspect, they're more likely to kill the suspect if they're white than if they're black. Also, if you look at police killings per crime, it's higher for whites than for blacks, right? If you look at the number of cops who are killed by people of different racial groups, you sort of like divide by the risk to the police officer based upon how often those people actually kill police officers. Um, they disproportionately kill white people, right? So like, anyway, and just like there's just like no evidence of a racial bias. The racial, if there's a racial bias, it's a bias against white people, right? Which sounds bizarre. How could it be a bias against white people? But basically, the reason is if they shoot a black person, it's going on the news. If they shoot a white person, it is not going on the news. So they're afraid to shoot black people, but they're not afraid to shoot white people.
Uh, okay, I can't really get into it. I don't want to mess up the algorithms. I did look at this data, and per capita, there does seem to be something about Latin people and Black people in certain cities being executed at a higher rate than Caucasians. If we're looking across the board in terms of pure numbers, absolutely, way more white people being killed by the police, bad interactions with the police in total numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
I meant per capita, so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. But if you control for a number of crimes committed, then it's a higher rate of shooting white people.
Yeah. Maybe I'll have you back on and we could do another show.
Yeah.
Okay. Final thoughts. This is the way I like to do this. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person that you don't know, you'll never meet. They're watching this interview. And they go, wow, I've learned a lot. I've heard some views I don't normally hear, and I like knowing that because I want to be informed. Maybe some unpopular opinions that are also true. I've learned a lot. But I'm struggling to remember everything that was said. But there's this one thing that the professor said, and boy, is it 5 days after I finished watching that interview. And I can't get that one thought the professor said out of my head. What is that one thought you want someone you'll never meet watching this interview to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after they watch this interview?
I think I have to think about that for a while.
Take it. You can have 30 seconds. Sorry.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's sort of like the point about how everybody's a human being. Like, academics are human beings just like the rest of us.
They're not perfect either.
Yeah. Like when I teach classes, I try to get people to think in terms of the incentive structures of our institutions, because like a lot of people just don't think that way. And so, like, why would an academic suppress part of their results, right? Like, isn't that bad? Well, you think about them as a person who has desires and has incentives. Think about what incentives are on them, right? What do they get rewarded for, right?
Right.
And like with the social media companies, we got to think about what their incentives are. Like, how do they get paid? Well, they don't get paid when you learn the truth. They get paid when like you share their thing and you click on it, and right. They get paid when they get attention. They don't get paid when they enlighten you. Okay, so you got to think about the effect of the incentives, right? Like I just want people to think about that when they analyze how things work, right? Like the wrong way to think is, oh, the job of a media company is to inform the public, so that's probably what they do. Right? That's the completely wrong way to think. The right way to think is, what do they get paid more?
Oh, right. You're talking about us as the public thinking of, yeah, right.
Yeah. So, okay. And then when you realize what the answer to that is, then you should evaluate how much you trust them in light of that. Okay. Right. Because like, their incentive is to say the thing that draws the most attention, that makes you want to share it, and that makes you want to click on it, and so on. Okay, and is that the most trustworthy thing?
You're sounding like the people who talk about media literacy. They keep saying the key to political polarization is people need to be able to think about what they're digesting rather than just passively just accept and don't question. That's what I hear you going. Is there a bias with these people? Why would they write this? What's the point? Do they want you to just know the information, or do they particularly have an agenda they want you to just accept?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, one thing is, well, people in the media have ideologies just like everybody else. You have political views, well, journalists have political views too. So that's part of what determines what they write. But also, they want to attract attention, and the way to do that is to say the most like alarming, frightening, or infuriating thing, right? And so, whether or not they themselves even feel that, they're going to try to
Right.
spin the story in a way that's more, outrageous or amazing or whatever. So,
Right.
and
More
and
views.
that's usually not the truth, right? The truth is usually not the maximally outrageous thing.
Other than on the Jerry Springer show or maybe Maury Povich. Yes, the truth's normally a lot more boring. Recommendations, you don't have to, but we always ask, we always try to keep the conversation going. Is there anybody you know? They could be an activist, somebody you know on the streets, another professor, somebody might be willing to be part of a conversation on political polarization and have an honest conversation.
Yeah.
Anybody on the left, anybody on the right.
I guess you already had Brian Kaplan on, I guess.
Oh yeah, that's how we got your name, and he was very funny and a very good, very funny man.
Yeah, you might think about Jason Brennan, the philosopher at Georgetown.
Jason Brennan at Georgetown. Okay.
Yeah.
And
He's pretty
any
cool.
other names? You don't have to, but we always ask.
Well, I'd have to think more to think of more names.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. There he is, Jason Brennan at Georgetown University. Okay, great. I really appreciate that. I will we'll end it there. I will send you a copy of the video today in your email, and we'll go from there. And I want to say thank you for coming out. Thank you for spending time with me. And thank you for being willing to talk about awkward, less popular truths, because I think they're very true because they're popular.
Yep. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Okay. I'll email you soon. And thank you for your time, Professor. I really appreciate it. Take care.